Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB, a conflict rapidly approaching its conclusion now that Lufthuron and his astral claws are all confined into the BADAB sector. The Lamenters surrendered to the Minotaurs in the south, and the Mantis warriors have shrunk back into the darkness of the Endymion cluster to avoid complete eradication at the hands of the Carcharodons. But even as the grip around BADAB was tightening, and Carab Cullen was preparing for the final offensive, worrying news was streaming out of the eastern Maelstrom zone. An uptick in raiding activity had Loyalist Command worried that a fleet of Astral Claws had somehow managed to slip out of the encirclement of the BADAB sector. And if it had happened once, it could happen again. There would be precious little use in crushing BADAB Primaris, expending the lives of thousands of Astartes and millions of Imperial Guardsmen, if the Astral Claws would then be allowed to simply just slip out from between the Loyalists' fingers. The hole would have to be found and closed first. And that operation started with discovering the source of the ever-increasing raiding activity. But finding it was going to prove a lot more difficult than anyone had initially imagined. For all their time spent in the autonomous zone, the Loyalists were still strangers to the fringes of the Maelstrom Warp Storm zone, and the many Imperial Navy scouting vessels first dispatched never returned, and soon stopped sending any reports back. In response to this, the search, locate, and destroy efforts were stepped up. No longer would single scout ships be dispatched to find the source of the disturbance, but small fleets made up of frigates, destroyers, and the occasional light cruisers would begin escorting the fringes of the Maelstrom zone, where they swiftly discovered that the reason why they'd lost contact with the previous scout elements were twofold. Either the poorly trained crew had simply been driven insane by their close proximity to the Warp Storm zone itself, or they had fallen prey to many of the myriad small bands of raiders, pirates, and micro-empires that dotted this absolute border of the Imperium of Man. And even when these small fleets were able to survive, getting anything worthwhile out of it was even more difficult than merely just existing. Out here on the fringes, you can never quite know who is friend and foe. You might come across a seemingly cooperative space station in the middle of nowhere that claims to be a long-lost refinery outpost, with a distress beacon active, just to have a pirate fleet ambush you as you approach it. Most of the planets themselves are either relics of human civilization long dead or changed to the point that they would be better off dead, and those worlds that still exist are recognizably human. Well, who knows which side they are on? The only records and archives that the Loyalists would have access to of this region of space are those archives that the Warders gave to the Imperium, now a couple hundred years out of date. So before the various survey and scouting fleets could even begin trying to locate the supposed Astral Claws raiding fleet, they first had to map out the area, figure out roughly where they were in relation to BADAB, and if any of the planets that they had records of still existed. And if they did, on whose side were they? The Imperial Navy's perseverance, however, paid off, as they came across a small, rugged frontier world by the name of Rook, populated by a rather peculiar bunch of Imperial servants, Oblationist Zealots. Now, this is a word that is, of special meaning, shall we say, within 40k. There is an ordo of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition that believes that the only way to fight against chaos is to embrace it fully. Not merely to use it as a tool, as some radical inquisitors might tell you to do, but instead to become chaos, to use sorcery, to become a demon host, and then use these powers to slaughter demon worshippers whilst relying upon your own absolute burning self-hatred of the corruption you've now let inside of yourself to remain in control. The armor of contempt, in other words, but taken to a far more extreme end. But of course, this was not a planet full of radical inquisitors in the middle of nowhere, obviously. Instead, I believe the meaning of the term here is used to refer to a population that has willingly chosen to live here on the absolute edge of the Maelstrom Zone so as to punish themselves, so as to torture themselves, and also to fight against the denizens of the Maelstrom in what they view to be the most efficient way possible. And whilst they might be completely and utterly insane lunatics, their loyalty was hardly in question. And so when they could report that their own world, as well as neighbouring worlds as well, had been hit ever more often by slaving raids led by what appeared to be an Astartes strike cruiser, and further analysis of picked captures and witness testimonies confirmed that yes, it was a strike cruiser, and more specifically, it was an Astral Claws warship named the Hyrcania. The Imperial Navy had found what they were looking for, but instead of finding a fleet of Astral Claws that had apparently escaped the encirclement of the BADAB sector, they had discovered but a single ship which had apparently managed to manufacture its own armada here, out in the fringes of Imperial space. Now that raises a great deal of uncomfortable questions. If it had been, as originally surmised, a breakaway flotilla that had escaped the encirclement of BADAB, then that in and of itself would be a definite headache, and something that would have to be hunted down, cornered, and destroyed as swiftly as possible. But at the end of the day, it was a contained threat. It was a quantified threat. If, however, the Tyrant had a hitherto unknown base of operation, another center of power that the Loyalists did not know about, hidden in the outer fringes of the Autonomous Zone, then it was impossible to know just how vast an influence the Tyrant really had here in the edges of his domain. Perhaps the Loyalists had severely underestimated his reach. Perhaps it was even possible that the main base of operation for the secessionists had already switched to this new and up until now unknown area. Determined to get some answers before returning to Vengeance Station, the pattern of the attacks were analysed, and eventually a predictive algorithm was created, and the scouting fleet was scattered over an area of space, hoping to intercept one of these slaving raids. And after having sat cold, dead, and silent in the void for many months, bingo! A raiding fleet appeared to strike at one of the small populated Imperial worlds in the area. Lacking the necessary military power to intervene, the raid was allowed to go ahead. And then, when the fleet, well gorged with slaves, jumped out of system, The Imperial scout ship hurried up into the area to begin analyzing the warp signatures of the craft and attempting to divine where exactly it was headed. Over the course of the next few weeks and months, many small test jumps and scrying attempts were made to determine exactly where the ships had gone. It was lengthy, complex, time-demanding and painstaking work, requiring dozens of small jumps in and out of the warp, this close to the edge of an active warp storm. The strain on the crew was considerable. But once more, the efforts of the Imperial Navy paid off, and they discovered a pair of worlds that were supposedly feral in nature in accordance with the ancient star charts. Shaprius and Sharfel they were called. But despite being feral worlds, the scout ships immediately detected huge amounts of ship-to-ship Vox transmission and surface-to-orbit communications as well. The entire system was alive with near-endless chatter, and they clearly weren't trying to mask their presence either, probably assuming that this far out in the middle of hell, no one would be looking for them. It was all the information that the Imperial Navy required. There was a substantial enemy base located in this system. Of what nature they could not yet determine, but they made sure to log as much of the communication as possible before beginning the long journey back to Vengeance Station, where they could inform the Lord Militant Carab Cullen that his worst suspicions were correct. Not only was there indeed a raiding fleet, there were multiple, and far worse than that, there was a fully operational and active secessionist base in the area that seemed to be able to not only generate further warships for the cause, ramshackable though they may be, but which was also carrying out repeated slaving raids throughout the sector, presumably both for labor and for additional military manpower. This was a considerable threat to the efforts to quash the BADAB system. If the Loyalists fully dedicated themselves to an invasion of such a heavily fortified area of space, and by any chance they were then fallen upon from the rear or the flanks by a hitherto unknown force, then regardless of its ramshackable and disorganized nature, it could inflict significant damage on the Loyalist forces. Worst case scenario, it might even turn a final assault into yet another disastrous setback. This was not the kind of news that Carab Khan wanted to hear at this crucial point. The Carcharodons were still busy finishing up the Tranquility campaign, and as of yet, no one quite knew on the Loyalist side where the Mantis warriors had disappeared to, whether or not they might still return, or if they had perhaps slipped into the BADAB sector itself. The Space Shark was thusly fully engaged. On top of that, the Minotaurs and the Sons of Medusa were also busy, as Carab Cullen had already launched them against the southern edges of the BADAB sector. They were currently carrying out a grueling campaign against heavily entrenched Tyrant Legion forces. And that battle was not going to be ending anytime soon. The Minotaurs had been severely depleted by the Lamenters and had lost a lot of their heavy armor and ground assault equipment. The Sons of Medusa were, as always, a hint hesitant to engage in a grinding-style open warfare. And to be fair, the prepared positions of the Tyrants Legion were considerable. Both chapters therefore agreed that it was time for the Imperial Guard to get their share of the glory. And so several penal legion regiments were organized and dispatched to the battlefield. And after the Triumvirate had carried out their justice on several worlds in the Autonomous Zone that had been found guilty of siding with the secessionists, there were no shortage of penal legion troops. But as they could not be expected to reduce the Tyrants' fortifications and forces purely by dying nearby, the sons of Medusa and Minotaurs were also required for the foreseeable future to make something worthwhile come out of the sacrifice. What then remained? Well, Carab Cullen's forces had been severely depleted, often by political infighting with Lord Inquisitor John Dice Frayne. The loss of the Fire Angels being only the most recent casualty of this conflict. Carab Cullen's own Red Scorpions, alongside the Exorcists, were currently being reorganized and refitted, supplied with new heavy armored vehicles, drop pods, and Thunderhawks for the attack against BADAB Primaris itself, and were thusly also unavailable. The only force readily available were the Salamanders, and there wasn't enough of them. Or at least so Cullen thought, until the leader of the Salamanders, Mir-San, stood forth in the council meeting and declared that he would take his single company of Salamanders, with himself at the head of it, and launch a surprise assault against the secessionist base. This was a brave offer, most assuredly. A company of Space Marines is a ferocious force capable of laying waste to entire planets, potentially. But they would be going up against at least one confirmed Astral Claws strike cruiser, and an unconfirmed number of other hostile assailants. The fact that two feral worlds were now awash in communication, signals, and apparent naval activity suggested that whatever forces Luft-Huron had stashed away on these planets were significant indeed. But Mir-San argued that so long as the element of surprise could be guaranteed, and there was as of yet absolutely no indication that the secessionists knew that they had been discovered, then he figured that 100 Salamanders equipped with plentiful heavy flamers ought to be able to do plenty damage, probably knocking out any facilities and killing a lot of traitors. Carab Cullen was, however, still hesitant to approve of the mission, since it would place not only Mir-San and his Salamanders at risk, but also their battle barge, the Pyre of Glory. The loss of the Salamanders and the Pyre would be punishing enough, but Mir-San had also become, well, now the only close advisor that Carab Cullen could truly rely upon. His loss would be a stinging one indeed. Then, something extraordinarily unusual happened, as Chaplain Ivanos Nkumi of the Minotaur stepped forward and for the first time offered an opinion. He said that if Mir-San was given leave to carry out his assault, then the chaplain would take his bodyguard of Minotaurs and join in the endeavor. This was quite the departure from the norm. The taciturn chaplain had up until now not offered any opinions in any of the strategic meetings. The full knowledge, of course, that the Minotaurs would do whatever they wanted, regardless of Carab Cullen's instructions. The only authority they seemingly recognized was that of the Legate Inquisitor. And yet now, their chaplain was offering to place himself, however technically, under the command of one of Carab Cullen's trusted lieutenants. It was an offer too good to refuse, not just for military reasons, but for the olive branch that it represented in political affairs as well. And so, the Pyre of Glory departed for the edges of the Maelstrom with Mirsan's Salamander and Ivanus and Kumi's Minotaurs, heavily laden down with Vindicators, Predators, and Thunderhawks. Mirsan was no fool. A heavy flamer will put a neat orange dent in most structures, but if you really want to take down an enemy encampment, nothing really beats a few dozen Vindicator shells. But before those could be fired, the biggest challenge had to be overcome, getting the Loyalist strike force not only in system, but to the planets themselves, with as little warning being given to the secessionists as possible. In this operation, the experience of the Imperial Navy captain who had discovered the secessionist lair to begin with was absolutely invaluable. In fact, the individual in question was known as a little bit of a genius when it came to scouting and deep space exploration. Una Nostromo had, whilst also gaining data on the secessionists' fleet, whatever little there was before returning to Vengeance Station, also taken the opportunity to gain some readings from the star system itself, and had noticed that several of the nearby stellar bodies were quite unstable and were likely to evict plumes of plasma energy and create other sensor-disturbing natural phenomenons that a single ship moving slowly and quietly might be able to take advantage of. And so after a long journey across practically the entirety of the autonomous zone, the Pyre of Glory emerged at the edges of the strange and chaotic system, using the twin stars' constant spewage of radiation into space as a cover. The Pyre of Glory then went quiet and began observing its target to try and find the perfect time to strike. Via various scans and survey probes, it was soon revealed that Caleb Cullen's worst suspicions were true. Hanging in low orbit over the closest of the two feral worlds, Chaprius, was a armada of star-faring vessels. The only real term applicable. They were not warships, nor were they merchantmen or bulk freighters or traders. They were all of these things and more. The dozens of prize vessels that had previously been rejected from service with the Maelstrom squadrons, even as small outer fringe patrol crafts, had apparently now been re-evaluated and found fit for duty. Upgraded with crudely welded-on slabs of armor and whatever weaponry the secessionists could lay their hands on, including even half-formed weapon batteries attached to the outside of the ship's hulls. Massive racks of dumbfire missiles of a seeming orcish design haphazardly slapped onto the vessels, in a seemingly almost desperate attempt to make them some sort of threat to other void-faring ships. And even then, these were still the lucky ones. Others seemed to serve no purpose beyond heavily armored prows, ramming suicidal fire ships, intended to be hurled towards the opponent and hopefully dragging them down in death alongside the vessel. And that was not the end of the bad news either. Down on the planet, the Pyre of Glory detected massive compounds that seemed to be some sort of unholy mixture of prison yard and military training area. This, then, was where the slaves captured from across the outer edges of the autonomous zone were brought and processed into a variety of slave warriors that would fight motivated by fear and threats in the name of the tyrant. Lefturon had certainly fallen a long way from his legion, that was certain. On the one hand, however, this was good news. The fear that there was a full-strength Astral Claws fleet at liberty in the autonomous zone was dispelled, though traces in the upper atmosphere suggested that there were several vessels that were not currently present. Old radiation signatures indicating proper warships, either of Maelstrom Squadron or Astral Claws origin, that were apparently away on some form of raiding or slaving mission, probably. But it did not change the reality of the threat. No matter how low the quality of this indentured army and navy was, it nevertheless represented a military force that the Loyalist command had not been aware of. And if it had been launched unexpectedly as a Loyalist advance into the BADAB primary sector, then it in and of itself would probably not have achieved all that much. But it would have forced a rapid redeployment and repositioning of Loyalist forces whilst they were heavily engaged by the Tyrants Legion and the Astral Claws, with potentially catastrophic consequences. You do not turn your back to the tyrant unpunished. The low quality, though, was also one of the reasons why the Salamanders now thought that they had an outstanding opportunity to not merely carry warning of this, but to perhaps even put a final end to the tyrant's hidden dagger. With most of the heavy elements of the raiding fleet absent, all that was left was presumably a handful of training instructors. Low-level Tyrants Legion personnel, along with perhaps a dozen or so Astral Claws. A very inviting target indeed, and it was unlikely that the Pyre of Glory and its Salamanders and Minotaur crew would ever be presented with a better opportunity. And so, throwing caution to the wind, any idea of waiting for advantageous stellar winds to hide their approach was thrown out the window, as Mirasan ordered a breakneck approach towards the closest planet, with all guns firing into the flotilla in orbit. And now, Captain Mirasan found himself quite grateful for the small Imperial Navy escort that had been dispatched alongside the Pyre of Glory. Originally, he had not been particularly in favor of the idea, and probably intended to send them away upon arriving in system, utilizing them instead as a simple escort just in case the Pyre of Glory was intercepted on its route to target. In a long-term, sneaky approach, the two Imperial Navy light cruisers and frigate squadron would only have been a liability. But now they provided precious extra firepower as the battle barge leading the charge smashed into the poorly organized hulks drifting in low orbit and set about them like a tiger in a henhouse. Shredding, ripping apart, crushing, and mercilessly obliterating dozens of these lightly armed, poorly trained vessels with absolute ease. They could even begin firing long outside of the usual effective ranges of torpedoes, lance batteries, and bombardment cannons. Normally, the natural limitation to void warfare is the enemy's heavy armor, their shields, and also calculating a correct trajectory, which can then be combined with a firing solution. A ship traveling at hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers per hour over distances of hundreds of thousands of kilometers is a remarkably evasive target. A bunch of barely prepared de facto freighters hanging stationary and at anchor in low orbit with engines so weak it would take them hours to wrest themselves finally from the gravitational pull of the planet? Sitting duck is simply not a strong enough term. But the destruction of the fleet in orbit was but a secondary objective. God Emperor alone knew how many other such rejected prize vessels were scattered across the autonomous zone. The Tyrant could almost certainly scrounge up further transports. It was the military forces on the planet that was the true target. Captain Mirasan had devised a hasty assault plan that he had transmitted to the Minotaur's chaplain. He would take his own Salamanders straight into the largest of the training yards and blast it open from within. The Fire Dragon's elite First Company Terminators would land on the planet's largest spaceport and render it inoperable, both preventing any potentially freshly arrived Astral Claws troops from reinforcing the training yards and also ensuring that they could not escape either. And finally, the chaplain and his Minotaurs would descend upon what seemed like a vast system of armored blockhouses, presumed to be the headquarters of the local Astral Claws detachment. It was a brave and perhaps somewhat hot-headed plan, as splitting his already limited forces was a considerable risk. But it would hopefully allow the Astartes to inflict the maximum amount of damage as quickly as possible, in case returning Astral Claw's heavy naval elements, or in the case of the resistance being firmer than initially anticipated, the Loyalists would be forced to retreat prematurely. As it stood, however, the goal was the complete annihilation of the Tyrants' training facilities on the worlds. The first wave was led in by Cesta's assault rams. These were occupied by the First Company elite Terminators, the Fire Drakes, which began by strafing the main starport of the planet. Caught completely by surprise, the overwhelming majority of the secessionist air power, primarily bulk transports and troop transports, were destroyed while still on the ground. And when the Fire Drakes were deployed from the assault rams of their transports, the chaos and carnage only increased. Mirasan had been correct in his assumption that most of the actual Astral Claws would either be in the training grounds acting as instructors or in the main apparent base area, with very few, if any, being located at the starport. This was an installation protected by secrecy, after all, not military might. And so the green armored Terminators strode through the unfolding chaos, vomiting out streams of explosive bolt rounds from their storm bolters, covering everything in promethium fire from their heavy flamers and unleashing salvos of micro-rockets from their cyclonic launchers. The only limitation imposed upon their destructive potential the time it took them to reload their weaponry, as the handful of poorly armed, scattered guard forces were not capable of offering any worthwhile resistance, with the occasional auto-gun round simply spanking harmlessly off thrice-forged Terminator armor. Simultaneously with the systematic obliteration of the starport, Mirasan led the majority of his company down into the heart of the largest single training ground on the planet. This assault included the vast majority of the contingent's armor, their Predators, Vindicators, Dreadnoughts, and Whirlwinds. all of which were deployed as rapidly as feasible, with the Salamander contingents entrenching around them after deploying from drop pods. And within minutes, a small, improvised, fortified position had been set up in the middle of the enemy's training ground, with most of the tanks being allowed to go hull down, in positions blasted out of the bedrock by pre-planned Salamanders explosive teams, and the Marines themselves going to ground behind hastily erected barricades created from the wreckage of their arrival, or in slit trenches dug out with the same shaped explosives used to create hull-down positions for the armor. It would appear that Captain Mir-San had allowed himself to be inspired by the words of another Marine officer, a member of a now long-forgotten, long-lost army of ancient terror, who had once said something similar to, "We've been looking for the enemy for some time now. We've finally found him, and we're surrounded." This simplifies things. As the Salamanders began firing indiscriminately out of their circle of iron. Caught in the initial deluge of firepower, thousands of the enemy's soldiers were cut down then and there, after which they gained their wits, or more precisely, the Astral Claw's taskmasters brought down their neural whips on their backs and began herding their soldiery towards the Salamanders, who swiftly noticed that these were no Tyrants Legion's troops. These were not Imperial Guard equivalent or even PDF equivalent either. Most of them appeared to be a variant of horrid stable and unstable mutants, the disgusting refuse and rejects of dozens of worlds nearby, not all of them of purely human origins. The tyrant had bred himself an army of monsters that he had intended to hurl at the unsuspecting back of the loyalists. Now instead, this monstrous miscreant, debauched fallen form of what had once been the tyrant's ideal of the Legion was being herded like so much bloodied cannon fodder towards the booming bolters of the Salamanders. This was also presumably exactly what Captain Mir-San had intended, as the corpses began to pile up around their positions to the point that the Vindicators and demolition teams had to venture forth from their prepared positions to blast and shovel away the mounds of corpses to clear up the fire fields of the Battle Brothers. The primary danger seemed to be running out of ammunition, and there was becoming a real pressing concern, as the Astral Claws did not appear to be running out of slaves anytime soon. Mir-San had, however, planned for this as well, and over the course of hours of this grueling engagement, he identified the taskmasters leading in the monstrous masses. And once he had fully figured out their location, he organized a strike force of land raiders to push ahead, crushing beneath their blessed tracks the mounds of enemy dead, and barreling forward while shrugging off the haphazardly scattered collection of enemy anti-tank low-grade weaponry. The Astral Claws, themselves trained and experienced in engaging enemy armor, saw this as an attempt at a breakout, and launched their own counterattack intending to engage and possibly destroy these armored vehicles, either intending to scatter their own positions or perhaps leading a general withdrawal from the fight, now that the Salamanders were completely surrounded and in the process of being overwhelmed. But even as the Astral Claws formed up to launch their own attack, the land speeders split apart and revealed what had been trunching along behind in their tracks. 6 Salamanders' ancient dreadnoughts barreling into the gathered Astral Claws, tearing, crushing, and stomping them apart, scattering them like a lightning bolt into a rotten tree trunk. fight was over in a mere matter of minutes, making almost a seeming mockery of the preceding combat in its entirety, having it all be decided so swiftly and so decisively, though the astral claws did not go without fierce resistance. These were some of the fiercest veterans of the Tyrants campaign, sent here to hammer these horrid, degenerate mutant swine into a resemblance of military discipline. And they had proven their absolute expertise by destroying fully half of the Salamanders' ancient dreadnoughts. 3 of their ancients are all busted open, torn and destroyed by point-blank melter charges and cracked grenades, shoved into wounds ripped open by power weapons and fists. But though it had come at a heavy toll, the astral claws were all dead and broken, the last of them torn literally in half by the ancient venerable Briarth Ashmantle, the Iron Dragon of the Salamanders chapter. The claw dying with the last shouted veneration of the tyrant on his lips. And with his demise, the controlling influence over the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, of remaining slave soldiers was broken, and thousands more would be trampled to death in the desperate need to flee the avenging sons of the God Emperor, who had now risen, bloodied, fire-scorched, but nonetheless terrifying from their slit trenches, and begun marching steadfastly into the hordes, bolters barking and chainswords roaring. And with this, the Salamanders had done their part, the Terminators and Mirsan's company alike. The rest now was in the hands of the Minotaurs and their assault upon the apparent headquarters of the Astral Claws. And Chaplain Ivanis Enkomi was clearly quite the big shot amongst the Minotaurs, as he, as his personal bodyguard, had brought with him a full company of the Minotaurs chapter, along with heavy armor, land raiders, dreadnoughts, vindicators, and terminators. I'm starting to see why Carab Cullen was so nervous about having this contingent on Vengeance Station. A full assault company belonging to a chapter under the de facto command of his primary political rival. That's enough to make any man lightly nervous. But for now, at least, it was the Astral Claws that were on the receiving end of their fury. The Claws had set up a command and control complex built into a small local mountain. They had set up multiple fortifications with interlocking fields of fire, all protecting a centralized large blockhouse. Loyalist scanners had been unable to penetrate deep into the structure, but there were indication of a substantially larger underground facility as well. In the initial assault, the Minotaurs would strafe the complex with Thunderhawk gunships, seeking to bust open one of the outlying bunkers or small complexes with their weaponry. They, fortunately, succeeded in this endeavor. If they had not, they would have had to launch a full-scale land assault on the fortification, which would swiftly have grown far more costly. Clearly, the Astral Claws had not been able to build the fortifications up to their usual standards, as one of the roofs of their bunkers was blown open by Thunderhawk's strikes. This allowed them to disgorge a unit of assault terminators supported by Devastator squads directly into the rubble, forcing the Astral Claws then to try and retake their own fortifications. They may also potentially have elected to withdraw deeper within their fortified bunkhouse, or potentially even into the underground complex, but Enkomi had accounted for this. he had only inserted a relatively small strike force of the Terminators and a couple squads of Devastators, whilst maintaining the rest in reserve, out of sight of the Astral Claws, who must have seen this as a fine opportunity to crush some of the Minotaur's chapter's elite. They were seemingly isolated from further reinforcements, and they had no way to retreat from the fortifications that they seemingly so hastily had broken into. An Astral Claws Retaliator squad armed with storm shields began marching on the ruined bunker complex, soaking up the heavy bolter and storm bolter fire to allow the rest of their assault contingent to get in close with the Terminators who stood their ground, thunderhammers and lightning claws flashing in the confined space of the ruined bunkers. They were equally matched in numbers, but the advantage granted by Terminator armor in close confines cannot be underestimated, and the Minotaurs were able to repel multiple assaults by the Astral Claws for long enough to allow the Chaplain to land the rest of his bodyguard strike force. Led by Land Raiders and Siege Dreadnoughts, they were now free to assault another portion of the Astral Claws' defenses, undermanned and occupied only by locally trained troops. They were no hindrance whatsoever to the bronze-armored Minotaurs who swiftly broke into the complex, and now the Astral Claws, already engaged to the front by the Assault Terminators and Devastator squads, were also assaulted in the rear by heavy armor, dreadnoughts, and Chaplain and Comey himself leading a squad of Vanguard veterans on jump packs, leaping from bunker to bunker, blasting in through the roof using breaching charges, and then following in bundles of grenades to clear out the occupants. The Claws had gotten lazy. Their reinforced bunkers and blockhouses would have served them well in the case of a slave uprising, but they were clearly not up to the task of repulsing an Astartes assault, as the Astral Claws team that had been engaging the Minotaurs now found themselves trapped in between two rapidly closing forces, and with no way to retreat back to their bunkhouses, they could only stand, fight, and die where they were. And they did. Whatever the Astral Claws may have lacked in the defense of fixed fortifications, they absolutely were not lacking in spirit, bravery, or determination, as once again they held. The Minotaurs paid a dear price indeed to crush the last few surrounded elements of the Astral Claws on the planet. But with their demise also ended the last significant source of resistance on the world. All that remained were a handful of essentially militia-level mutants left within the blockhouse that could be cleared out at will. First, the Minotaurs set about making damn sure that none of the Astral Claws would be getting back up again, when they noticed something highly unusual. Out of the roundabout half company's worth of Astral Claws, a significant percentage of them were apothecaries. These are rare medical experts within an Astartes chapter, specialized both with the treatment and retrieval of wounded battle brothers, and also the gathering of the vitally important Astartes gene seed from those who have fallen. This special organ, grown in the neck of each and every battle brother, contains the genetic data necessary to create a new Space Marine. They are, therefore, the chapter's future, and by far its most precious resource. The presence of apothecaries in all battlefields were usually an absolute necessity, but the numbers found here were far beyond what would be required of some backwater garrison post. The sinister truth behind this irregularity was revealed as Chaplain Comey and his Vanguard veterans began pushing in to the reinforced blockhouse. As mentioned, the defenses were hardly a challenge after the fierce battle in the outer fortifications. The mutants themselves often chose to run rather than face the bronze-armored Astartes, and the handful of automated gun turrets were simplicity themselves to disable when compared to the recently departed Astral Claws. But despite the absence of any true threat, the advance was still slow and ponderous. The underground complex had been far larger than it had appeared on the preliminary scans, and every few meters the Vanguard veterans ran into a massive fortified blast door, often protected either by sentry guns or militia mutants. They needed to bring up Terminators and Tech Marines to blast and slice their way through each and every obstacle. The blast doors and the airlocks, the reinforced chambers only grew more frequent and thickly armored the deeper they got in. Chaplain Enkomi, at the head of the Vanguard veterans, began to wonder why the Astral Claws had not retreated within the depths of this ludicrously heavily armored bunkhouse. If they had done so, defending each breach point, each door, each bulkhead, it would have been hellish to dig them out, and would probably have required days, if not weeks, of continuous, brutal, grinding, step-by-step siegecraft, with repeated, costly breaches the only way to advance. The answer was made obvious indeed when Chaplain Enkomi, after the Terminators had sliced their way through yet another meters-thick blast door, emerged into a vast room, softly lit by dim green light, and saw ahead of him hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny armored glass containers. Each last single one of them contained within it the unmistakable organic lumpen mass of a Space Marine gene seed. I imagine that even the normally stony visage of Chaplain Enkomi would have cracked into jaw-dropped astonishment at the sight, his surprise only growing ever more profound as they began sorting through the containers and noticing that several of them were marked not as Astral Claws gene seed, but as Lamentor's gene seed, Mantis Warriors gene seed, Minotaurs, Red Scorpions, Sons of Medusa, Fire Angels, Firehawks, and the other Loyalist chapters as well. The Astral Claws had been stealing this vital resource, the very lifeblood of a chapter, and hoarding it here for dark experiments. The uncovery of several large surgical halls were later made, where the dissected bodies of the feral mutant population of the planet were still located. Some so fresh as to still have steam rising from their split-open innards. The Astral Claws apothecaries had not merely been experimenting on ways to hasten the Astartes' transformation of turning a man into a superhuman space marine, they had also been testing out the gene seed itself, attempting to modify it, to graft it on to different hosts, to mutate it, to improve or otherwise change it. This was heresy of the highest order that made the Astral Claws' previous crimes of going against the teachings of the Codex Astartes pale by comparison. It also immediately changed the focus of the entire Loyalist operation in system. Upon hearing of the discovery, the Salamanders immediately moved their own forces over to the fortified bunkhouses to secure it and begin reclaiming this unfathomable bounty. And to make it clear as well, this was not merely a vital, valuable resource that had now been discovered and could be captured and recaptured in the case of Loyalist gene seed. The Space Marines viewed the gene seed with a degree of near ritualistic reverence. It is the DNA of the God Emperor and their Primarch. It is sacred to them. It is the very future of their chapter. And to see gene seed thought lost, rediscovered, and reclaimed from those who stole it is a powerful moment in any Astartes chapter's history. Fortunately, the Space Marines did not have to redeploy rapidly either. There was always the threat that the battle in orbit might not have gone their way, or the Astral Claw's heavier elements may have returned. But in fact, the battle high above had gone exceedingly well. The ramshackable flotilla presented very little real threat to the Pyre of Glory and the small Imperial Navy force assigned to it. Though in their haste to strike quickly and decisively, scanning data had failed to notice a series of orbital weapons platforms that had opened up on the small Imperial flotilla with considerable effect. The poor Pyre of Glory had again been near crippled, just fresh out of the docks from its previous nasty encounter with orbital weapons platforms. The poor battle barge seemed doomed to repeat this particular occasion again and again. Worse off was the sword-class frigate Epona, which had been completely gutted stem to stern and had to be abandoned. Crucially, however, the two Imperial Navy light cruisers had escaped the confrontation with only minor and superficial damage, and could so begin taking aboard prisoners rescued from the slave pens down on the planet. Only 1,000 were recognized as human enough to be deserving of rescue. 1,000 out of tens, if not hundreds of thousands, of forced slave soldiers, but hey, it's something at the end of the day, and if you want a happy-go-lucky universe, you have come to the wrong place now, haven't you? More importantly, the gene seed was immediately brought aboard the Pyre of Glory. That kind of a prize could not be entrusted to any other ship, no matter how battered the venerable old battle barge might be. The safe recovery and transportation of the gene seed, however, slowed down the process of evacuating the planet, and it took the strike force a full 11 days before they could depart the system. I imagine Captain Mir-San sat every last minute of those 11 days with his dual hearts competing for space in his throat, expecting at any moment reports to come streaming in of warp disturbances near the edges of the system and the arrival of the rest of the Astral Claw's raiding fleet, probably led by at least one strike cruiser and a significant number of claws. But the God Emperor smiled on the bold Salamander once again, and no raiding fleet ever appeared, until the Pyre of Glory and the rest of its strike force could safely enter the warp and begin its long journey back to Vengeance Station, where they could not only deliver the good news that the secessionist threat to the Loyalist advance upon BADAB Primaris had been crushed, but also that they had seized significant stores of Loyalist gene seed. Though I imagine Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne will be more than capable of finding a dirty, dark green lining rather than a silver one. This was clear evidence that the heretical activity of the Astral Claws stretched far beyond his initial estimations, and might even lead to an even stricter punishment for the system at large. But before these joyous tidings could be delivered, the Pyre of Glory and its strike force needed to actually make it back to Vengeance Station, traveling through the tumultuous waters of the warp at the edges of a warp storm. And whilst Big E might be smiling, there were other entities out there in the great immaterial tide who were not so amused. And the Pyre of Glory, along with its small Imperial escort on the way back to Vengeance Station, was suddenly accosted by one of the violent warp squalls that the region was so justly famed for. One instant, the fleet was trucking along with no sign of any danger or disturbances, and then, in the blink of an eye, a frigate was torn in half, and the flash of its destruction, and all the souls aboard being suddenly tossed into the immaterium, was experienced like a pang of pain, fear, and anger by the other astropaths leading the fleet. The rest of the ships immediately headed for calmer waters, but it was too late. The storm surge had already caught them, and the Pyre of Glory, along with the light cruiser Admiral Gregorius, was swept away from the rest of the fleet. The brutality of the storm was such that Mirsan saw no other option than to dump his two ships out of the warp in an emergency translation. This was always a very risky affair, as demonstrated by a certain Lamenter's strike cruiser that reappeared within the confines of an irradiated star system, so deep within the local toxic sun's gravity well as to make it impossible for the ship to escape. Mirsan and his Salamanders might easily be forced to suffer the same fate, but the astropath reported that there was an indication of a small, calm, bright spot in the storm, and if a translation was to be done, it should be done immediately. And Mirsan was not the kind of captain to hesitate. He gave the order for both ships to drop out of the warp simultaneously and found themselves in the Kala Shoals, a relatively calm area within the Maelstrom's borders. Now that at least was a relief. You never know with these warp storms. The ships could have been carried millions of miles in any direction. Hell, it is not unknown for ships to be carried back and forth in time itself during these sudden upheavals in the Immaterium. But it seemed as if Mirsan and the Salamanders, along with the Admiral Gregorius, could breathe a sigh of relief. Minor damage here and there, stress damage mostly, incurred by the sudden and violent transition. But this should be relatively easily repaired, and once the ships had properly gotten their bearings again, they could resume their journey towards Vengeance Station. And precisely simultaneously, also in the Kala Shoals, a single strike cruiser in the blue and white livery of the Astral Claws detected two loyalist vessels suddenly popping up on their auger rays. The Hirikana had returned to the training ground to discover the region that it had been ordered to guard and supply with slaves thoroughly decimated. They'd also picked up the spore of the people responsible. Maybe the Salamanders weren't going to get away with it so scot-free after all. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.